Hi, I'm Jamie Banks, and I want to talk to you today about some reasons to study Latin that are based on how rich and big and modern and long the Latin language literature tradition is, the Latin textual tradition, and not so much based on arguments you hear from schools and parents and administration and society about Latin being good language for the SAT or making you smarter or being good for logic or being better actually than other languages because it's not. Um, so I was going to do this presentation by giving you an overview of the 2000 plus year history of Latin literature. That was an idea I had in my head. But what I realized is you can get that in Wikipedia. There's websites like the Latin Library where you can see just the range of texts that are available. There's plenty of things that there's books and volumes that you can read. There's videos on from Latinitium, for example. There's lots of different resources for convincing you that there's a long history to Latin literature, more than 2,000 years of it, because it's still being written today. So rather than give you an overview of any kind of history of it, I realized that at some point that my goal was to show you that there's something in Latin for everyone, no matter what age you are, what ability you feel you have with languages, what your relationship with Europe or a European tradition is, um, what kind of language education you've had in the past, how good you are at maths, any of that, where you are in the world, that there's something that will likely resonate for you within what's been written in Latin, no matter who you are. That's an argument that was made for a long time by a lot of people in British imperialism, in an Italian and European tradition, mostly in a colonial context or in a white European context. But the range of Latin literature is so much wider than we think that I think that argument can still be made that it really is something for everyone, even when what we mean by everyone is really everyone and not just that sort of traditional image of this white Christian European man. It's really much broader than that. So, some reasons not to study Latin. If you want to learn French or Italian or Spanish or Romance language, and you have this idea that it's based in Latin, so you can use Latin as a foundation, well, linguistically, it is. The Romance languages are based in Latin, you know that, grammatically at least, and with a lot of their vocabulary. But you're going to progress a lot faster, not by having some sort of abstract foundation and spending lots of time on Latin first, but going directly to French or Italian or Spanish or whatever you want to learn. So don't learn Latin in order to learn another language. Just go learn that language. You'll be more motivated, it'll be more fun, and it'll be much more related to your goals. You'll get a lot more out of it without wasting your time with sort of abstract ideas of language that you're going to get in a lot of Latin classrooms, especially. Um, don't do it to get better at chess or math or logic. To some extent, it's true that Latin gets you better test scores in the GRE and things like that, but that's really because of how it's taught and how Latin vocabulary comes up in science and such things. Um, Latin is taught very often for reasons having to do with keeping Latin in the schools at all compared to other more popular languages. Latin is taught in a way that sometimes emphasizes the written word, emphasizes the grammatical structure and conjugation and all that stuff that everyone hates in modern languages. Not everyone, not people watching this necessarily, but lots of people. Um, so all those benefits that Latin sort of people say Latin has, and people argue to students that Latin has, or to parents, are really side effects of how Latin is typically taught rather than any kind of special feature of Latin as a language. Um, Everyone in ancient Rome, not everyone, but Latin was the native language of a group of people in ancient Rome and throughout the Roman Empire. And so it can't be inherently harder in all ways. Every language has certain areas that are going to be easier or harder. As people watching a video from a Polyglot conference, you know that very well, that there aren't, sometimes it feels like it, but usually it's about the method and the resources you have available. What makes a language harder to learn, or sometimes based on your prior experience with different languages and how related they are. It's not about Latin is or any other language is inherently by its nature harder for everyone. That's not the case. And don't take it by obligation. Don't study it by obligation because it's the foundation of Western civilization or any kind of silly idea like that. There are plenty other foundations of plenty more interesting things. So study it, do study it for itself. And I'm not saying that Latin is better. That's an argument that's made a lot and can shade into things like white supremacy. But I am saying that Latin was the language of a civilization that was better documented for a lot of different reasons. Some of them pretty shady. But we have a lot of Latin text. We have Latin graffiti from places like Pompeii, electioneering campaigns, um, love poetry with sex workers, um, all sorts of things. It's not just high literature, and we don't have that kind of coverage and range of things from very many other civilizations for a whole bunch of reasons, not all of them innocent. Some of it's about what people considered value judgments about what to preserve, and that's related to the power dynamics and politics and all of that. um, but that's the situation we have. Latin is one of the best, is the language that we have one of the best documentations and the longest and most comprehensive histories for, in terms of painting a picture of all different levels of society, all different interests and groups of people of that linguistic community that use Latin. Um, so I just said a lot about Latin and the Romans, but one of the things about reasons that you might find Latin very accessible and find that I believe that everyone can find something within it include that Latin is not just the language of the Romans. Long after it ceased to be anyone's native language, it was a chosen language for scientific communities in Europe, for people in the Renaissance or the early modern period, as we tend to call it now, in Italy, in Spain, in what is now Germany, in other words, the Holy Roman Empire at that time. We have people writing across borders to each other in letters and scientific treatises, sometimes scientific treatises in letters. Galileo, for example, announces the invention of his telescope in a little, basically, pamphlet that he then sends around to his friends in the scientific community who speak Latin. And so we have this great mix of the personal and the professional, the academic and the more family and human and intimate side of things, that shows up in a lot of post-classical Latin, both in the medieval period and what we might call after that Neo-Latin, which tends to refer to Latin in the early modern period and later. Um, so for anyone who has technical interests, we have Newton, we have Galileo, we have Giordano Bruno, we have all sorts of astronomers, physicists, mathematicians, biologists, Carl Linnaeus, who are writing in Latin, and that's a whole treasure trove of resources, illustrated resources a lot of the time. There's the German Comenius, who wrote one of the first picture books, Orbis Pictus Latinus, and um, there's just a huge range of Latin texts in science, in history, in theology, but not as serious as that sounds. So we get, on the one hand, a much fuller picture of scientists who, as people with wide-ranging interests. For example, we learn that Kepler, the astronomer, who, if we know him at all, most of us know for the planetary laws, about uh, the rate of motion of an orbit, of a planet in an orbit. Kepler also actually wanted to be a theologian. He was a devoted Christian and only studied geometry and astronomy after being convinced by his mentor that he could sort of read the book of nature that God, in his view, had created or written through studying science. In the same vein, Newton has is a manuscript in Jerusalem of a history of comparative religion study that's as voluminous as Newton's physics works, that show that Newton had a deep interest in not just science but alchemy, the occult, and religion and society. So on the one hand, we have these much richer pictures of who we think of, who come down to us as these genius men of science, that they're actually much broader ranging than that and more human and more accessible and relatable. On the other hand, we have things like the Missa Potatorum in the medieval period. There's a whole genre, the drinker's mass, and you have these very learned monks um, from the way that these things are written. We know that and how closely they follow the Tridentine Catholic, the Latin Mass. Um, of the time as well. We know that these people were actually monks, probably, who were writing these things, and not excommunicated monks or lapsed monks or anything like that, but actual monks. And they were highly irreverent. They're writing, you know, a mass for the pub, basically, and also practicing monks. So Latin very often gives us these texts that are hilarious in themselves, but also show a deeper social history and a more interesting and irreverent and kind of underbelly or counterculture to what gets sanitized as the narrative of the history of ideas, of military and social history, etc. Um, we have other things like bestiaries, which are mostly a medieval genre. And one person to know there is Albertus Magnus, who writes something like a 700-page manuscript full of the history of the natural, the science of the natural history of the natural world. So this is these fantastic combinations of a National Geographic style, very detailed, precise description of a lion's feeding habits and form and reproduction, alongside an interpretation of the lion as Christ, alongside these wild fables about the lion that are handed down from ancient sources that people that clearly Albertus Magnus or other people writing other bestiaries never actually saw from firsthand experience. And again, these bestiaries, sure, they can tell us a lot about the history of science and about how biology developed in the Middle Ages and later, but really they're just kind of full of fascinating facts. There's sometimes a Guinness Book of World Records for the animal world, and they're also of great interest for folks who are interested in illustrations. There's some great illustrated manuscripts, and they're also just of interest for the literary qualities, for the stories they hand down, for stories about or for stories that continue to be passed on through these texts from the ancient world, myths about animals, like how the bear cub emerges totally unformed and the mother licks this cub into shape, into the cub's final form. There's all kinds of weird and wonderful things in the bestiaries as one genre, just an example of a common medieval text, Latin text. They're all also Middle English and other bestiary traditions, but very often, if you know the Latin tradition of a genre in the Middle Ages, you see interconnections with the traditions in the vernacular languages, in the languages that still have native speakers at the time. And um, there are other things. Um, uh, there's a 500-page novel written by a Dutchman in Latin who it's science fiction, and it's also a satire about European society, and different forms of government. He has the government of the monkeys, who have a certain form of republic, and there's other creatures who have an absolute monarchy, all sorts of things. Again, this theme of things being really fun, but also enlightening and illuminating for social commentary about the society of the time and the views of the author. We have, of course, the more traditional stuff, the humanists you might have heard, the humanists, and also you might have heard of in more of the Renaissance period, the scholastics and the sort of the philosophical tradition from the medieval period, especially at the University of Paris. Um, but we also have things that come in the Latin. We have Latin as an intermediary language. So Latin, for example, in 12th century Toledo in Spain, we have a translation movement of translating Arabic texts into Latin, and also Latin texts into Arabic, from which we get a lot of the Greek tradition, ancient Greek tradition was passed on to medieval and early modern Europe. So Latin, again, for a lot of reasons, some of which aren't great or aren't too palatable right now, um, it is a language. It was a useful language that many people learned to learn law, to communicate with each other, to do diplomacy, so you have the contact of different cultures and the sharing of literary as well as historical and political traditions through Latin. And just one last example, and then I'll stop the innumerable examples that I could give. Latin is also an interesting language to learn other languages through, even though I said don't do that at the beginning. If you happen to already know Latin and you want to learn other languages, one thing I did, for example, is use a bilingual. There's a bilingual Latin Italian edition of Dante's Inferno, and I have some Italian, but not enough to read Dante in the original. So I actually used Latin and the commentary on the Latin text to when I couldn't figure out the Italian. I read them beside each other, and there's all sorts of creative texts like that, commentaries and multilingual editions where if you know Latin, you have access to other languages as well. So hopefully that's convincing in terms of how much there is in Latin, even if you don't care at all about the Roman Empire and the people who use Latin as a native language. There's still quite a lot to learn. Also, even if you're not a poetry person, if you're more interested in medicine or history or whatever discipline it might be. But I want to get to the point that Latin not is still a language in use and a creative language where we're creating new things, new experiences, new texts, new literature. So I speak Latin, and that's one of the reasons that I can read some of these things fairly fluently. I speak Latin because it's fun and because I like to have dinner with friends in Latin, because I speak Latin because I've made friendships with people who I don't share a native language with, but I do share Latin with. So it is an important language for me socially, and there are other people for whom that is the case. But I mean, I would say the vast majority of those people, if not all of them, would still tell you that speaking Latin is a way towards reading Latin better. So sometimes speaking Latin gets a bad rap and it's seen as kind of silly, or why would you do that, or it's just super nerdy. But it lets me have access to that tradition I just talked about, rather than spending an hour decoding one paragraph of Cicero or one paragraph of any Latin text. So, but I do want to honor that the spoken Latin isn't just a tool towards the end of reading. It's also just really powerful as motivation and as a social community. So in the U.S. and in Europe and around the world, in the last maybe 30 years, there's been a real revival of and the founding of many new institutions, immersive experiences, curricula that are all based around spending time together speaking Latin, often under a sort of uh, pledge that that's the only language that you're going to speak unless you have an emergency. So those some of those are Salvi. There's in North America. There are people in Boston and in Lexington, Kentucky, who run week-long Latin events for some people who have about a year of Latin under their belt, some Latin grammar, to supercharge their speaking skills. But beyond that, there's in Italy, Schola Humanistica and Schola Latina. There's Kailum, which is a convention in Madrid every year. There's a tremendous number of resources, and more kind of as a grassroots things coming up every day. There's YouTube channels, readers that are at sort of all levels, including middle school. There's people publishing um, original Latin verse and also translations from other languages into Latin, um, partly to make it accessible, just like that was the case 500 years ago, where Latin was an international language. That's in a small way becoming so again. And it's a very self-selecting community, not in the sense of elitist, but in the sense of people are all choosing to spend their time with this language. So it's a passionate group of people, and in that way, maybe similar to Esperantistas, the Esperanto speakers, who also form a sort of international community based on a in Esperanto's case a created language, but in both cases a language that doesn't have um, in the modern world native speakers yet. Anyway, so yeah, there's and then there's the question of resources. So there is creative work being done in Latin. It's still a living language, I would say, and not just in the Catholic Church. Um, there's generative power, so there's new things being created. It's also a great opportunity because only about 1% or less of the text that has been produced in Latin has translations into any modern language. So, as an academic or as a career or translator, Latin is a great language to get involved in, even if a lot of what you're going to be doing is diplomas and certificates. I've had some of the most interesting projects in my translation career have been because I speak Latin and therefore I can translate fairly fluently. From letters from key players in the Protestant Reformation to a botanical text to someone's family history in the Byzantine Empire, who happened to the records were kept at a monastery. All sorts of interesting things because of my I treat Latin as a living language. So there's a group of people who are still interested. There's the opportunity for new creative work. There's the opportunity for um, doing interesting work in old areas and sort of going beyond the traditional canon that people think of from 2,000 years ago. Um, so if you're sold on that, there's also a tremendous number of resources. I mentioned some of them. There's look up YouTube channels of Scorpio Martianus, of Latinitium from Daniel Pedersen, of Magister Craft, who has a whole world in Minecraft. That's a replica to scale replica of much of Rome, ancient Rome. There are a tremendous number of people making new resources, and increasingly there are resources for beginners and intermediate students as well, and as well as resources that are from the 19th century, so 1800s, that are out of copyright on the Internet Archive, archive.org. So even though it's been traditionally a very elitist language that a lot of people don't have access to training in, the internet has really changed that in terms of both access to tutors and communities, but also access to resources, and so many of which are out of copyright. Google Books in Latin is also a source both for researchers, for editions of scientific texts, but also for learning materials and just sort of playing around and seeing what you find. Um, so, um, I hope this is convinced or at least interested you in um, pursuing Latin or trying it out, or at least looking up some of these resources. Um, Again, the main point is just that it's a much longer and richer and more varied tradition than just Caesar and the stuff that shows up on exams or in college courses. Another point that if you treat it as a living language, it's both more fun and more effective learning, and that there are actually at this point the resources out there to learn as an autodidact or in a small community or outside of formal schooling in a way that's actually much more in line with the linguistics research. Um, Thank you.